Hi there, I'm Valerie Francis, and here's a tip that will help you hook your reader right out of the gate. Somewhere in the first 5 pages of your story, let the reader know what it is your main character wants. This want is called an object of desire. And the word desire is really important here because there's lots of things we want in life, right? But there's very few things that we desire so badly that we'll really go after it. And this is what your main character is doing. Whatever it is they desire, they'll go after it with everything they've got. And that's what your story is about. This week's episode, The Devil Wears Prada, is a brilliant example. Now, this is just one idea. I'll be covering a whole lot of others in the Hook Your Reader webinar coming up on February 22nd. Go to hookyourreader.com for more information. If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. My name is Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
And I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor, and poet, and I have a passion for spy stories, fairy tales, and master detective novels.
On today's episode, Melanie pitched The Devil Wears Prada so that we can study subtext. This 2006 film was directed by David Frankel from a screenplay by Aline Brosh McKenna and based on the book The Devil Wears Prada by Lauren Weisberger. Of course, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie. And as always, we would love it if you could give the show a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Just scroll to the bottom of the landing page for the show and click some stars, 5 of them preferably. It's that simple. All right, Melanie, what do you have for the genre?
All right, so this week, I have to admit, I'm not confident with my picks, but I've got for the global genre a worldview maturation, and for a secondary genre, I didn't really have one. I'm sure there's one there, but by hyper-focusing on subtext, I couldn't find one. So what did you have?
I think the global genre here is a performance business story, given Andy's object of desire, and that the film is about how she performs at work, kind of like Legally Blonde that way. And the value that's at stake here in the story, she even goes to the negation of the negation. She is publicly honored but self-ashamed. And that's the scene that's toward the end when she's in the car with Miranda. For me, the secondary genre is status admiration, which is a principled protagonist rises without compromise.
All right, so we are different this week, but instead of talking about it in a great deal of detail, I think some of this will come out in our discussion going forward. So I'll talk about some of the obvious but interesting examples of subtext in The Devil Wears Prada. So, and it's really obvious, and of course, when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense if it's a movie that involves the fashion industry. So first we look at Andy's wardrobe, and this is what really tracks her internal and external changes throughout the movie. But it's not just the clothes she wears, it's also who helps to dress her. And at the start, Andy dresses herself, and her choice of attire is a lot like Daphne's from Scooby-Doo. She's got tartan woolen skirts and brogue types of shoes with lumpy jumpers. And when Andy starts to care about her job as the junior personal assistant for Miranda Priestley, the editor-in-chief of Runway magazine, she asks Nigel, the art director, for help. Now, Nigel reluctantly starts to style Andy and select her clothes for her. But by the time Andy accompanies Miranda to Paris for Fashion Week, she's selecting her own outfits and styling herself. Now, and Nigel makes the comment that his work here is done. So that's a really good and obvious way to track a lot of, the main subtext of this movie is through those 2 things. Now, as Andy's knowledge of the fashion world and her confidence as Miranda's assistant grows, Andy starts to sell out. She starts to forget what is truly important to her, and we see this via her personal relationships outside of work. She ignores her father during dinner and accidentally closes the door of the taxi on him when she's trying to organise flights for Miranda. And she continually turns up late and tetchy for dinner with her friends and her boyfriend until finally he breaks up with her. Now, the clothes and Andy's involvement in Miranda's world provide us with a physical representation of those internal changes that she's going through. And we all understand why Andy is undergoing such a shift in priorities. And I think this is really clever as well. So she needs a job to pay the rent. And that comes out and is stated really obvious in one scene of the movie. And also, as Emily says, and I quote, "If you work for a year for Miranda, you will get a job at any magazine you want," end quote. And Andy wants to be a journalist. So they're two pretty big carrots and pretty good reasons why she would continue to go along with this job. Now, along with Andy's fashion evolution, I've just noticed that there are a lot of shoes, handbags, and coats in every shot where the runway workforce is. And again, this is on theme for a movie that is set in the fashion world. And maybe it's expected, but when I really started to watch this movie and drill down into it, I couldn't help but notice how many there were. And maybe it's my fascination with shoes as well that I found an affinity with some of the workforce. However, all right. Auntie is a real fish out of water at the beginning of this movie, and it's clear that she believes the world of runway and haute couture is frivolous. Miranda turns out to be a sadomasochistic boss. Why would Andy stay? Now, I've talked about her need to pay the rent and the law of getting a journalist's job anywhere, which is very enticing, but there's a repeated phrase which is, "This is a job millions of girls would kill for." And this is said repeatedly to Andy when she talks to people about working for Miranda. Now, this repetition serves a few functions in the movie. So Miranda and go with me here. So Miranda and Fletch from Whiplash are very similar in a lot of ways. They are manipulative and abusive. And Miranda punishes Andy by giving her impossible tasks, or the impossible task of obtaining an unpublished Harry Potter manuscript for her twin daughters, after Andy witnesses a fight between Miranda and her husband. So this repeated phrase makes you think, why would a million girls dream of this job or kill for this job if this is the way anyone would treat them? Well, there's also scarcity, and there's the myth of desirability that phrases like, "This is a job a million girls would kill for." And using that and repeating that creates a lot of our awareness about scarcity and the myth. So it is being close to the sun and also seeking the approval of the revered and the feared Miranda that I think makes Andy put up with Miranda's behaviour. So the brilliance of The Devil Wears Prada is that it creates this plausible reason for Andy to buy into a world she doesn't understand, then join this world, and then turn into a person that she doesn't want to be. So the fear of losing her job and her access to the exclusive world of Miranda starts to turn Andy into Miranda. And this change is so subtle that we don't realise it until Miranda points it out to Andy at the end in Paris. There's another phrase that is repeated by Miranda, and it's the phrase, "That's all." And this is Miranda's way of dismissing her assistants and other staff, but its meaning changes with her tone. And over the course of the movie, the way Miranda says "that's all" to Andy changes. It becomes less dismissive and more respectful, if that's possible. But this is really good acting, and it's not always something that we can do in writing, unless we set up a lot of things to make sure that the tone changes as well. But anyway, this is a really good thing to watch, and there's a subtlety in the way that Meryl Streep delivers this over the course of the movie. Now, as Andy's star rises, Miranda changes the division of labour between Emily and Andy. Emily is very clear at the beginning that she is the senior assistant and Andy is the junior. But Miranda then goes to support this delineation on a daily basis by throwing her bag and her coat on Andy's desk. However, once Andy accepts Miranda's offer to go to Paris, a trip that Emily has been looking forward to for many months, Miranda starts to place her bag and coat on Emily's desk again. So Emily, in this same scene, has also been given Miranda's gopher tasks again, which is something that clearly was Andy's job to do. And Miranda seems to enjoy creating that chaos for her assistants anyway, but she's given those back to Emily at this point of the movie. At the beginning of this season, I talked about how subtext and text we use in Home Alone to set up and pay off certain events in the story. And the wonderful thing about The Devil Wears Prada is that the opposite seems to happen here, or the subtext and the setups have multiple payoffs. So there are examples where setups are created via the dialogue, so in the text, and then paid off by subtle action, so the subtext later on in the story. Then here's an example of what I mean. When Miranda goes to a preview of designer James Holt's collection, Nigel explains what Miranda's facial expressions mean. So 1 nod is good, 2 nods is very good, and there's only ever been 1 smile on record. And then if Miranda doesn't like something, she'll shake her head. And if she purses her lips, then it's a catastrophe. So Miranda does purse her lips at James's collection, but she also has a smile for Andy at the end of the movie when she sees Andy across the street. But the smile is done off scene for Andy, but something that we see as the audience. So we know what that means because that setup has been really clearly put there and then paid off when she looks at the rest of the collection and James has to go away and redo it. But then it comes around again at the end of the movie when we see her smile when she gets into the car. So I think that's really clever and a very efficient way of using characterization and having multiple payoffs after an initial setup. And the smile is to me, that's an element of subtext. And it doesn't have any words, but I thought that was a really clever thing to do. Now, there's something new that I'd like to raise this week because the character of Miranda presents some novel subjects via the subtext in the movie. Now, Miranda obviously has a great deal of power and influence, and Nigel says at one stage that Miranda's opinion is the only one that matters in the world of fashion. And it is this way because of the power and the influence that she wields as the editor-in-chief of Runway. But we don't fully understand how powerful she is until we see her manipulate her own boss into changing his mind about replacing her as the editor-in-chief. We learn that the same coercive control Miranda has over her staff, which is where she leads by creating fear in her employees, is the same control she has over her own boss. To avoid losing her role as the editor-in-chief, Miranda provides him with a list of all the designers and models who will follow her if she leaves that magazine. And he is clearly not happy with this in the scene when she announces or her coup d'etat actually becomes apparent to those who are in the know. But it's a really interesting and not surprising when we see it aspect of her character, but also I think it looks at leadership. So what I'm highlighting here is how Miranda's character is created not only by her title as the editor-in-chief of Runway, but more specifically by how she leads the magazine and the team who produce it. Now, there are also some terrible messages in this movie. Andy's weight is commented upon frequently, and we all know that Anne Hathaway is not fat or big. Andy comments at the beginning that she's a size 6 when Nigel is roped into helping her with her clothing choices. And at the end of the movie, when Andy's successful, she's a size 4. We also see Emily starving herself in preparation for going to Paris with Miranda. And we also see in the cafeteria scene that it's only Andy that has substantial food on her plate, and it happens to be soup. And then Nigel comments that the main ingredient of chowder is cellulite. So I think that that's not necessary. It's not surprising, but I don't always think that it's a positive message that we actually want to be sending. Now, this is not a perfect movie by any stretch, but the subtext I found really serves the story. It's used to support the setting, and it helps create the characters. The costumes represent Andy's internal world and her maturation arc. And Miranda's character is clearly shown, or the complexity of her character is clearly shown through the text, and is also represented in the subtext through her actions and her leadership style. So Valerie, how did the middle part of the story stack up this week?
Just before I get on to that, as you were speaking, something occurred to me. You're exactly right. They're talking about the, 6 is the new 4, 4 is the new 2, whatever it was. 6 is the new 14, 4 is the new 2, 2 is the new 0. And Emily's joke that she's one stomach flew away from her ideal weight, which just cracks me up. So in the fashion world, in the extraordinary world, you have people who are starving themselves to death, but Andy's boyfriend is a chef, and he's making her grilled cheese sandwich. Fancy grilled cheese sandwiches, but grilled cheese sandwiches. So there's the difference between, the starvation in the extraordinary world, and if you're starving yourself, what happens? It's death, right? And Miranda's very cold, and there's all that's sort of how that world is presented versus the nurturing and the food and the happy times with her friends and her family. Really interesting. I didn't pick that up until you were just talking about it. All right. For anyone learning to identify the act breaks in a story, or anyone who wants to see an excellent example of the hero's journey in action, The Devil Wears Prada is a great movie to study. This is a linear Archplot story that follows all the quote-unquote rules of storytelling. There's nothing fancy about the structure, nothing at all. But it's solid, right? It's a solid pitch, straight down the middle, right over the plate. In terms of the math of storytelling, and I talked about this last week, so if you haven't heard that episode on 4 Weddings and a Funeral, go back and listen to that. The math for The Devil Wears Prada breaks down like this. The beginning is 24%, the middle is 50%, and the end is 26%. Now, if you listened to last week's episode, you'll remember that I referenced a man named Greg Hartley. He's a body language and interrogation expert from a YouTube show called The Behavior Panel. And he says that, quote, an organism does what makes the organism successful. And this is a great way to think about the hero's approach to the extraordinary world. So Act 1 of a story is the ordinary world. Act 2 of a story is the extraordinary world. So Andy's extraordinary world is her job at Runway. Yes, she does start it in Act 1, but it's not until Act 2 that she takes it seriously. That's when she decides to double down on her efforts, because she knows that if she can last a year in that job, she'll be able to work for any magazine as a journalist. In other words, she'll get her object of desire. And Melanie, I think it's really interesting that you and I have honed right in on the object of desire this week. A little side note here, because I love me a good side note. The Devil Wears Prada is also an excellent example of the objects of desire. Now, the object of desire has a lot of names. It's also called the protagonist's want. Personally, I prefer the term object of desire, a lot more because it better describes what's happening at the story level. Like, we want a lot of stuff in life, right? But there are a few things that we desire so badly that we'll do absolutely anything to get them. So here, Andy wants to be a journalist, and she wants that so much that she is willing to endure a full year as Miranda's assistant to get it. And I agree completely with the comparison between The Devil Wears Prada and Whiplash. Whiplash, another performance story, by the by. So for Andy, this means devoting her entire life to the fashion world and to that way in living. It means morphing into one of them, sacrificing her relationship with Nate and her relationship with her friends. She is sacrificing a lot. So think about your protagonist's object of desire and consider what lengths she'll go to get it. All right, back to The Devil Wears Prada and this concept of an organism does what makes the organism successful. In Andy's ordinary world, she has a great work ethic and a can-do attitude. That's what made her successful as a journalism student. So, when she enters the extraordinary world, which is her job at Runway, she brings that same work ethic and can-do attitude with her. She thinks that if she just works hard enough, she'll make it through the year. Emily doesn't think she will. Neither does Nigel, and neither does Christian. Andy takes this as a challenge, or perhaps even an affront. As expected, in the extraordinary world, Andy is immediately tested. This is what happens in the extraordinary world. There's a terrific montage of her trying to keep up with the daily office duties and the regular errands for Miranda. And it starts with, as Melanie pointed out, all these times that Miranda just throws her purse and her coat on Andy's desk. It's a tough job and it's exhausting, but Andy triumphs. She hangs in there. So after this montage, she ends, on a bit of an upswing. She still has her job. The next main challenge comes when Miranda's flight has been canceled due to a storm, and Andy has to book a new flight from Miami to New York for Miranda. And of course, this is a challenge that she fails because nobody is going to fly in a storm that bad. But Miranda is livid. It means that she has missed her daughter's concert. Now, how does Miranda retaliate? She tells Andy that she's a disappointment, and she says that she regrets taking a chance on her, a chance on, quote, the smart fat girl, which again, as Melanie pointed out, is hysterical because there's nothing fat about Anne Hathaway. And there's nothing fat about Andy either. She's a size 6. That is not fat. But this comment really cuts Andy to her core. She is genuinely hurt. And she goes to Nigel looking for sympathy, but he does not give it to her. There is no sympathy in the extraordinary world. None. It's cutthroat. It's eat or be eaten. Nigel spells out to Andy what the extraordinary world is all about. And he says, if you don't like it, you can leave. In fact, you should leave. Now, keep in mind that keeping the job with Miranda for a year is Andy's way of getting her object of desire. So she can't leave. She realizes that she has to assimilate. Now, while she naively thinks that this assimilation means looking like the others and fitting in visually, we see over the course of the rest of the film, it also means acting like them. And Melanie, you picked up on this too. When Andy changes her appearance, she's on the upswing again. Her friends are liking her new job too because, hey, Andy brings them all kinds of really nice free gifts. And this is when we hear Andy defending Runway. And she talks about the great articles that they have. And Nate, her boyfriend, calls her out on it. He says she's been drinking the Kool-Aid. Andy even manages to anticipate Miranda's needs and starts to earn a modicum of respect. She's given the honor, the great honor, of waiting till 10:30 every night for the book to be finished and then bringing it over to Miranda's home along with her dry cleaning. Now, the first time she does this, unfortunately, she makes a really bad mistake. And instead of leaving the book on the table in the entryway, she walks upstairs. And she ends up walking in on Miranda and her husband who are having an argument. Now, it's already been set up for us that Miranda is an extremely private woman. So when Miranda turns around and sees Andy on the stairs, we're really wondering, oh, what's going to happen now? And of course, Meryl Streep is so good that one look from her really sort of makes your blood run a bit cold. And the next day, here's Miranda's punishment for her. Although Miranda is so calm and her voice is so quiet, it kind of reminds me of the character of Claire in A House of Cards, right? They're so quiet that the hushed tones are actually menacing. And Miranda tells Andy to get a copy of the unpublished Harry Potter book by 3 p.m. And this is book 7 of the series, and we all remember the secrecy and the security around that book when it came out. So this request for the Harry Potter book is the midpoint shift. After this midpoint shift, the protagonist is thrown into chaos. And when she's in chaos, everybody and everything in that fictional world is in chaos too. Up to this point, Andy's been able to keep up with the challenges that have been thrown at her. Not always really well. She has her low points, but she's hanging in there. This idea of working harder and this can-do attitude have kind of been working. But in the chaos phase, which is the second half of Act 2, the protagonist is flying by the seat of her pants. To survive it, she has to become a whole new person. And Melanie, you just talked all about this. Unfortunately, Andy doesn't see that she's changing. She believes, and she even says this to Nate, I'm the same old Andy, just with better clothes. Now, typically, at the end of Act 2, the protagonist hits an all is lost moment, which means they are as far from their object of desire as they ever will be. And it looks like there is no way they will ever get the thing that they have set out on their journey to get. Now, you may think that the invitation to Paris is anything but an all is lost moment. But actually, in terms of her inner journey, it is extremely low. It is her lowest point. Why? Because she compromises her values by taking Emily's place. And she doesn't even realize that she has done it until Act 3 when Miranda points it out to her. Now, here's the thing. During the entire film, Andy keeps saying that she doesn't have a choice. And this is a key element of the status admiration genre. Why? Because status admiration is all about a principled protagonist who rises without compromise. She chooses, the principled protagonist chooses not to compromise her principles. Basically, that's what it's all about, her choice and how she behaves. So when Andy does compromise her values, what's happening is that she's spiraling further and further downwards, and she's moving further and further away from who she really is. It's only at the end when she walks away from Miranda and Christian, the two people who she thought could give her everything that she wanted, that she actually achieves her object of desire. Miranda admires Andy for walking away and going after her dream. That's why she gives the good recommendation, and that's why we see, as Melanie rightly pointed out, that little smile at the end. So this is another film that we can easily excuse because of its entertainment value, like Four Weddings and a Funeral, like Groundhog Day, like Legally Blonde, and a lot of those other movies that we've looked at so far here on the podcast. And it is laugh out loud funny in places. But the key to its success, and the reason so many big names are attached to it, is because the story itself is rock solid. And for this reason alone, it's a great one for us to study. All right, Melanie, I think we're at the action steps. What do you have for us today?
We are. So this week, I'd like you to think about the reasons behind your character's actions. Write a paragraph or a scene where the character says one thing, but their actions or habits reveal the truth. What actions, micro or macro, do you have to choose from to show the inner conflict in your character?
And that wraps it up for this week and for the season. Melanie, can you believe we're at the end of another season? So that means next week we will be doing a roundup of everything we've learned in the past 10 weeks about the middles of stories, or Act 2 of stories, and subtext. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For access to writing templates and worksheets and more than 70 hours of training, subscribe to my Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/innercircle and follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. If you'd like to find out about books to help you read like a writer, visit Melanie on Facebook and Instagram under Melanie Hill Author, or find out more about her from her website, melaniehill.com.au. And remember, story theory does not have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.